Hello and welcome to the Somerset Archaeological and Natural History Society, which is usually known as SANHS. My name's Lizzie Induni and I'm the current chair of SANHS. This evening, Dr. Matthew Knight will give a talk about putting metalwork in its place, an analysis of the late Bronze Age and earliest Iron Age finds from Somerset. Dr. Matthew Knight is the Senior Curator for Prehistory at National Museum Scotland and responsible for the Chalcolithic and Bronze Age collections. He's particularly fascinated by the production, use, treatment and deposition of material culture, notably metalwork, and its meaning to the Bronze Age communities. In 2018, he completed a PhD at Exeter University, exploring this topic in relation to Southwest Britain. And in 2022, he published this monograph entitled Fragments of the Bronze Age, the Destruction and Deposition of Metalwork in the Southwest Britain and its wider context. As usual in our webinars, Matthew will take questions at the end of the talk. To ask questions, you'll need to activate the chat button at the bottom of the page and type in a question. To find the button, just run the mouse over the bottom of your screen and a series of buttons should pop up. If the button's not there, it might be at the top right or even hidden under 3 dots. Because we're recording this lecture, we won't use names in the question time. It's free to register for the talks, but a donation of £5 towards the ongoing costs of SANHS would be gratefully appreciated. The donations button is on the SANHS website donations page. When donating, please label your donation Bronze Age Webinar. And to make things easier, a link to the donations page will also be posted on the chat button at the end of the lecture. So, over to Matthew.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. And thank you everyone for attending today. I am delighted to be speaking to you virtually on this topic, looking at the late Bronze Age and earliest Iron Age metalwork, primarily recovered from Somerset. As Lizzie said, I undertook my PhD looking at this topic. And this paper very much draws on some of that work, a little bit of work that I've undertaken since, and is reflective of a forthcoming paper in the next proceedings of SANHS. This talk is guided by a little bit by this call to arms from Andrew Fitzpatrick in the Southwest Archaeological Research Framework, where he mentions that metalwork studies have generally been poorly integrated with other areas of investigation, notably the study of other aspects of material culture and the use and deposition of objects, and likewise depositional patterns in relation to sites and landscapes, including natural features, haven't really been explored in detail. And what this is reflective of is the traditional Bronze Age metalworks scholar has often focused on aspects of typology, form and character, and there's been fewer studies that have sought to integrate all the other facets of Bronze Age life. So whilst I don't claim to address absolutely everything that Andrew Fitzpatrick calls for here, I hope that I go some way towards rectifying some of this discrepancy between the data and we see going on elsewhere at the time. As I say, I draw upon my PhD data set at looking at objects and contexts in relation to each other, and specifically with this talk, I'll be tackling the period right at the end of the Bronze Age, conventionally referred to as the Late Bronze Age, and the earliest Iron Age. A bit of a misnomer for Somerset, as this period of that's referred to as the earliest Iron Age. In fact, we've yet to find any iron objects that conclusively date to this period, 800 to 600 BC. But I choose these chronological boundaries because they provide quite a nice contrast to each other, as we'll see, and offer some interesting perspectives on Bronze Age society and culture at this time. In total, there's about 425 objects within my data set, and these are overwhelmingly things like socketed axes, specific type of form dating to this period at the turn of first millennium BC, as well as swords, spears, knives, and smaller other objects. But as we'll see, the ornaments, personal ornaments such as rings or bracelets, are relatively few, and the data is overwhelmingly some more tools and weapons. And these are found in lots of different contexts and are treated in variable ways. A brief sort of overview of the find spots and the context in which these objects were found. I broke the data down into single isolated finds, those recovered from settlement and activity areas, those associated with two or more objects or in hordes, scatters of objects from across a single field, and burials of which there's only one potential association. But what's quite striking is that when you divide this chronologically between across the two periods under study, the late Bronze Age into the earliest Iron Age, there was overwhelmingly more find spots dating with material dating to the late Bronze Age, 158 in total, versus 13 from the succeeding centuries. And this is also reflected in the absolute number of finds, with only 44 from the earliest Iron Age, compared to 381 from the late Bronze Age. It's obviously important that this data is set against the backdrop in which people were living, the landscape and the settlement of Somerset at this time as we currently understand it. And I'm sure the audience here tonight is very familiar with the sort of dynamic upland lowland landscapes of Somerset, with the upland areas of Exmoor, Quantock Hills, Mendips, flanking the lowland areas of Somerset levels, and the Avon levels to the north, as well as the Bristol Channel, which forms that northern boundary. And while I've mentioned the find spots of metalwork so far, the evidence of late Bronze Age and earliest Iron Age settlement and activity areas that are associated with metalwork are relatively few. Only 5 in red here. And these almost exclusively date to where structures survive. These almost exclusively date to the late Bronze Age, though there's clearly some Iron Age activity happening at many of these sites. But we're not. If we expand this to other sites where metalwork hasn't been found, there's really not that many. There's not that many that have been found, though this number is slowly growing with more and more research projects. But it is striking how few there are across the county as a whole. Exploring this a little bit further, I'm going to delve into a couple of specific case studies. Here you see the fantastic hill fort at Cadbury Castle, which is well known for having had a long period of occupation. And there's from this site, there's 47 recorded bronze and gold artifacts dating from the very early Bronze Age through to the earliest Iron Age. You have an early Bronze Age axe head here on the left, and an earliest Iron Age razor here on the right. It's much of this material was found scattered, but concentrated around the late Bronze Age layers, where contemporaneous pottery was also found. Though Cadbury Castle has a much longer life beyond the Bronze Age into the Iron Age and Roman Iron Age period. And this is partly reflected in the treatment of metalwork as well, because this early Bronze Age axe that you see here wasn't recovered from a Bronze Age layer. It was in fact recovered from a Middle Iron Age pit, some 1500 years after it was first produced. So we're seeing, we're probably, we can be fairly certain that metalwork is being deposited within these settlement areas, but it's clearly being rediscovered as more interactions with the site go on over time, and this material is being dug up, redeposited in later periods. Same thing is happening at Ham Hill, where again you've got a scatter of metalwork predominantly dating to the late Bronze Age into the earliest Iron Age, though with less direct associations with particular periods of settlement and structures. But it emphasizes this long use of these hilltop locations preceding the hill fort phases, which they're quite famous. Another notable area of settlement activity is Breen Down, and this is late Bronze Age midden site, and you've got these two gold bracelets that you see in the top right, dating to the late Bronze Age, that were discovered eroding out of a sand cliff in the 1980s, and they were found interlinked with each other, and further exploration noted that these had they didn't find any signs of a container, but they did find a fragment of gold buried with them, and near to that there were a couple of occupation layers that had pieces of pottery, bone and shell that are contemporary with the bracelets, and further investigation of the site also revealed scatters of Bronze Age metalwork that seems to be fairly scrap, but clearly this is one of the few instances in Somerset where we have a hoard deposited associated with settlement activity, and we can pretty closely link the people living in this area with this activity. Another activity area comes from the Somerset levels, an area around Bray Lake, where investigations identified a timber platform or wooden structure with these oak planks that survived. Dendrochronology indicated the felling of these planks at around 962 to 942 BC, so around just shy of 3,000 years ago, and associated with this platform was sheep, the remains of animals, sheep jaws, as well as human bones, bits of pottery, some quartz pebbles, and this burnt, broken and crushed socketed axe head that you see on the right here. And there seems to be a fairly set of quite performative actions associated in this area with this structure. Everything has been fragmented. It doesn't matter if it's metal or if it's an animal or if it's human bones. They've been broken up and thrown, seemingly placed or thrown into this wetland area, and we see this at other places as well, in the Avon levels at Cabot Park. That's about the sum of metalwork deposition associated with settlement and activity areas. Then by far the data are dominated by single finds. These are isolated objects that have been recovered from across the region, either through chance discoveries or most recently through metal detecting and reported through the Portable Antiquities Scheme. And this has really increased the distribution picture of the material that we know of from the region. You can see that socketed axe heads are overwhelmingly found as single finds compared to everything else. Everything else is fewer than 20 finds and most are fewer than 10. So alongside socketed axe heads, there's spearheads are relatively common, knives, swords, but nothing is as overwhelmingly prevalent as socketed axe heads. And the black bars represent the material that's from the late Bronze Age, whereas the small segments of white are the earliest Iron Age, and you'll see that there's just a smattering of axes from the earliest Iron Age and 2 vessel ring handles that probably come from a bucket or cauldron dating to that 800 to 600 BC period. Distribution-wise, the little black dots that you see widely scattered, these are the single finds, and as I noted earlier, of the 171 find spots, over 150 of them are single finds, and these are dominated by sort of axe heads. Ornaments are incredibly rare, and one of the things that's interesting to look at in terms of single finds is ways that they've been treated and ways that they've been placed in the landscape. Single finds are typically considered to represent lost material, accidental discard or scrap material, but when you've got such a large number, it's become, and proportionally such a large number compared to other forms of deposition, it becomes increasingly likely that there are elements of deliberate deposition and deliberate burial of these objects that's happening. So we can think about where some of these finds are concentrated. There's certain river valleys that have these concentrations. The River Avon has quite a portion of these. The Somerset levels, again, there's quite a few from there, though that might also be reflective of the amount of peat cutting, increasing the chances of discovery. But it's also important to note the areas where they're not found as well. So Exmoor, for instance, and Quantux, they have notably few finds recovered from them, and this isn't through lack of investigation. These are widely surveyed areas that have seen antiquarian interest as well as modern interest, and it seems to be a genuine reflection of areas that were avoided for metalwork deposition in the Bronze Age. Thinking a little bit more about some of these wetland sites, quite a few haven't just produced single finds from the late Bronze Age, but have also produced material that spans the length of the Bronze Age, from the early Bronze Age around 2000 BC, right the way through to that transition to the Iron Age. The peat cutting at the Turberies at Glastonbury in the 19th century revealed 13 pieces of metalwork spanning this period, and we're familiar with Neolithic material that's come from these areas as well. And similarly, metal detecting in these sorts of regions is also producing a comparable picture. So I throw up here a collection of finds from Middlezoy, not far from the Grey Lake site that I've already mentioned, and this includes an early Bronze Age dagger that you see here in the top left, a Middle Bronze Age axe here at number B, and then a collection of broken and complete socketed axe heads. And what this suggests is that we're dealing with places that, like the hill forts, that were revisited repeatedly over long periods of time, and where we're repeatedly finding finds from these sorts of areas. It strengthens the idea that these are places that held some significance and metalwork was being deliberately placed here. It wasn't accidental loss, although some of it may have been, but where you have concentrations, it's certainly indicative that people have very long-term interactions with these places, and it might be that these are places held in cultural memory as sites for metalwork deposition. Moving away from isolated finds and instead to finds that have been metalwork finds that have been found in association with each other, and here I've defined associated finds and hoards as two or more objects found together. You've got late Bronze Age associations in the red stars and earliest Iron Age finds in the yellow stars. There's remarkably few, and this is surprising, not least because when you ask people about the late Bronze Age in Europe, they often define it by the mass deposition of metalwork in hoards. And indeed, there are tens of thousands of objects buried in hoards across Europe at this time. But Somerset has relatively few, particularly in comparison with other regions of Britain and Ireland, a point that I'm going to come back to. And what's even more striking is when we delve into the history of some of these discoveries, there's actually very few that we can say are securely hoards or securely closed deposits. So there's only two late Bronze Age hoards that are definitely closed deposits, the one we've already mentioned from Brean Down, and this one that I'll come to in a minute from Sturgsey. Whereas the other four are a bit more circumstantial, and likewise with the earliest Iron Age hoards, one from King's Weston Down is a definite closed deposit, whereas the one from Stawley Community Parish is probable but not certain. And one of these uncertain hoards, to give you an example of what I'm talking about, is this collection of metalwork recovered from Hayne in uncertain circumstances, but donated to Somerset Archaeological Society in 1931, and it represents material from the early Bronze Age, this axe here on the left, two Middle Bronze Age power staves, and a late Bronze Age axe head. And chronologically, these span about 1,000 years, if not a little bit more. So we can't be absolutely certain that they were all found together, although there is evidence that sometimes prehistoric communities did gather older material with newer material, although we can't be certain, and it's perhaps more likely this is an antiquarian collector's hoard, someone who's gathered this stuff together from the same area and given it under the same provenance. More convincingly, we have this possible hoard from West Bagworth, where metal detecting in this area has so far produced 3 gold rings. I don't have a picture of the third to show you, unfortunately, but they're found in sufficiently close proximity that that we can suggest that this is probably a dispersed hoard, and this is probably even more the case when we consider how rare gold ornaments are from the region. The fact that 3 have so far been found from the same area suggests they're part of the same deposition practice. On to one of the closed deposits from the late Bronze Age. It's a really significant find, not just in Somerset, but across certainly southwest Britain, and I'd argue a bit more broadly as well. It's a group of material comprising axes, weapons, pieces of ingot, and there's 146 complete and incomplete objects that were deposited that were found during drain cutting in 1870 were all crammed within a cubic foot. It's probable there was some sort of container, but this was not recorded at the time. And it's the largest hoard in southwest Britain, and easily one of the largest hoards in southern Britain, at least until relatively recently. This is its location here, right on the north coast. And although it was found in 1870, it took about over 100 years for it to eventually be published by Roberta McNeill in 1973, who did an excellent job detailing the finds and particularly noting the different styles of axe heads. And this is important because socketed axe heads in a late Bronze Age context often portray regional styles, and we can link styles of axe heads with different manufacturing traditions elsewhere in Britain. And this led McNeill to describe the hoard as a key hoard drawing together influences from the north, south, east, and west. And what this looks like in practice is that we've got an axe head that probably came or fits within manufacturing traditions in Yorkshire, as well as Meldrith and Welby axes, which are more typical of Cambridgeshire and southeastern England, as well as 13 South Welsh axes within this hoard. And to put this in perspective, those 13 axes in a single hoard represent more than a quarter of all of that type of axe found in southwest Britain. But I think we can go further than talking about manufacturing traditions. I think what we're looking at more broadly is actually a particular ideology associated with hoarding that we can link with people. And we can do this by looking at what's actually happening in South Wales at this time. And here you see a hoard from St Nicholas, Cardiff, which is another group of material very similar in style to what we see at Sturgersey, and includes complete and incomplete axes, spears, swords, and also axes of different styles representing different regional traditions. And there's a number of these hoards of varying sizes, none as large as 140 odd objects so far, but all concentrated around this south coast of Wales and the Vale of Glamorgan. And so what I think we're actually seeing is people or ideologies moving across the Bristol Channel in the late Bronze Age, and people bringing with them, either bringing a hoard of material with them, or bringing the idea of how to build a hoard for deposition with them, and eventually burying it on the north coast of Somerset in reference to the transportation route across from South Wales. And I think that this must have been quite a significant event just for the sheer scale of the hoard. It's often been considered a scrap hoard on account of the amount of broken up pieces, and indeed some of this stuff may have been destined for may have been part of the recycling process. But I think more importantly, what we're seeing is a reflection of how you make and deposit a hoard, or that speaks to these regional practices, is elsewhere. And it connects North Somerset with what's going on in South Wales at this time. And that's even more stark when you consider this is the only hoard of its type from the whole of southwest Britain. Moving on to the material that's deposited during the earliest Iron Age. I mentioned a hoard from King's Western Down, which I don't have images of, but I'll mention briefly here because this is a collection of complete and broken, one complete and and broken axes, and the rest broken axes, about 27 broken axes, which are all typical of the earliest Iron Age tradition of making axes, but seemingly deposited at around that transition point around 800 BC and deposited on later fort at King's Western Down. And it seems to be linking back with older hoarding traditions, and in a sense, even though it contains objects that we might chronologically date later, it's more suggestive of earlier traditions. And the same is true at Storley Community Parish, where we've got a typologically later axe head alongside earlier knives. And again, this is the result of metal detecting within a broader area, and this probably represents a dispersed hoard. But this is not none of this is indicative of a community, of a set of communities for which hoarding is kind of a prime activity in the same way that we see elsewhere in Europe at this time. Moving away from deposits of metalwork, metal artifacts specifically, I want to think a bit more broadly about evidence of metalworking and the production of these objects, which is a really important facet of this process, because we have all these metal objects, but who's producing them? Where are they coming from? What's that relationship between the people who are burying the objects and those who are producing them? Until fairly recently, the last 20 years or so, sites with metalworking evidence from Somerset were confined to a couple of stone moulds from Ham Hill and a collection of moulds from Norton Fitzwarren, dating to the Late Bronze Age. But since then, investigations as part of the South Cadbury Environs Project and other commercial developments have found additional sites from which metalworking material has been recovered. And here I summarize kind of the extent and character of what we're seeing. And although it's 5 sites, what I want to draw your attention to is the number of fragments and crucibles and molds that are all being found. And all of these, except for the material from Ham Hill, are clay. They're ceramics that often survive quite poorly in the ground in some of these areas. But you'll note that work at Sigwells has produced not 1 but 2 deposits of metalworking moulds, and at Yatton there's over 2,000 fragments that have been recovered from across 2 Late Bronze Age pits. But the actual absolute numbers of the objects produced from these fragments are relatively few. 2,000 mould fragments seems to produce a minimum of about 13 objects. And what's quite interesting here is that the objects that are being produced, while they do include things like swords and spearheads and socketed axe heads, which are the common finds that are being made in metal, it also includes a large number of fittings, pins, ferrules, kind of ornamental material that we don't typically see as finds and as metal finds. So the moulds and the metalworking evidence is suggesting there is material that's in circulation that is not ending up in the ground after production. I mentioned Sigwells, and I'll focus a little bit on it here, because this is a group of material that's currently under study, but derives from work undertaken by Richard Tabor and others as part of the South Cadbury Environs Project. And work on this material has been done by Christoph Skowronek as part of a master's thesis, and highlighted quite a large amount of refitting material, but also some really interesting elements where we haven't just got moulds, but also potential stone and bone tools associated with a Late Bronze Age enclosure, and indeed 2 phases of metalwork production happening. And even more remarkably, the team were able to refit molds for a sword with an actual sword held in Somerset County Museum. This example from Midsummer Norton, about 30 kilometers away, which suggests that the metalwork that's being produced is moving within a moderate range of its production site, but you know, some of this material is staying relatively local. The role of metalworking and at this time, it seems to be small scale operations. They seem to be located at certain sites. There's nothing that's suggesting you've got smiths who are moving around the country or operating big production centres that are dispersing material across wide areas, as has previously been suggested. And this is the pattern that we're increasingly seeing across Britain and Ireland at this time. And what's also quite interesting is that the material that's being found is being treated quite similarly to metalwork hoards. The material is being highly fragmented. It's being placed in pits, in ditches, and in a region where hoarding of metal objects isn't so common. Perhaps we should be looking for other caches and hoards of material, and perhaps metalworking is one of those arenas that we should be looking into. And the value and importance of being able to produce this material then gets reflected in the eventual deposition in significant locations. So to start to bring this range of evidence together and focus on a couple of kind of key points, I want to think about what the data tells us in terms of these contrasting periods that I've chosen to study. And you know, they're fairly notional academic periods in a sense, but they're widely explored across Bronze Age Britain and at the moment, and we can see quite a lot of material that's being deposited during the late Bronze Age, in contrast with what's happening in the earliest Iron Age. And this has traditionally been viewed in terms of a collapse of the bronze industry. The traditional idea is that bronze went out of fashion, people abandoned all this material and instead adopted iron. But iron wasn't being used at this time in Somerset, or at least evidence for it is very limited, and you know, there aren't a comparable number of iron artifacts that are emerging. And we also see developments in new types of metal objects that are being produced. And this isn't just true of Somerset, this is true more widely, where we see things like razors, swords, spearheads, horse gear, axes. They're all being developed in new forms and in new ways. And alongside this, we have the emergence of early hill fort sites, midden sites that are showing that salt production is quite important, shale production, a whole range of craft developments. We can look quite close by to areas like the Vale of Pusey in Wiltshire, or the Purbex in Dorset, or even across the Bristol Channel in South Wales. Midden sites are emerging and being used for hundreds of years and are important social centres. So I think rather than seeing the lack of bronze objects being deposited as a collapse in the bronze industry, I think it's more reflective of how visible the archaeological evidence is for changing social practices. For whatever reason, depositing metalwork ceases to be important in the way that it once was, and instead other elements become significant. And it's not that there is a social collapse as such that happened. People continue to thrive, but in different ways, and express their ideologies in different ways. This is also true when we think about the different scales of deposition that we see within the late Bronze Age. I've highlighted that you have quite a large number of single finds that have been buried in Somerset, and this is in contrast with other regions across Britain and more widely Europe, where hoarding is the thing to do. You have there are large numbers of hoards and large numbers of objects buried in southeast England or in South Wales, and even elsewhere within southwestern Britain, but less so in the Somerset region. So we need to think about what's happening here in terms of how people are approaching deposition. And we can partly look at this through the Southwest Peninsula. Here I have mapped late Bronze Age hoards. Every red star is another hoard, and you can see you've got concentrations along the south coast of Devon, another concentration particularly on the St. Just Peninsula here, and we've discussed the smattering of finds from Somerset and Dorset is much the same. And as mentioned earlier, we should also look at the gaps. You can see large areas where in North Devon, Eastern Cornwall, where no hoarding seems to be taking place whatsoever, and it's the same in large parts of Somerset as well. And then we can put in the single finds, and here I show the red stars still reflect the hoards, and the other material largely represents single finds, though the settlement evidence is also in there as well. We can see, particularly for Somerset, how those single finds completely fill the distribution gap, and even in these other areas where hoarding was less common, single finds start to pop up, and it's a similar picture in Dorset as well. And what this, I think, tells us is that whilst hoarding might have been recognised as, yes, the done thing in certain parts of the European Bronze Age, people were still people at these times, and they will have done things in their own way. Hoarding will have been important, regionally important in different ways to different people. This may have been influenced by access to resources, access to ideologies and networks of communication, but it may also be that single finds, depositing a single axe head, fulfilled a certain social function that a hoard and did the same thing that a hoard would. And finally, I want to mention the role of landscape in what's happening at this time. I think this is what underpins how people live their lives. People in prehistory were very, very reliant on the land. They had intimate relationships with it, and I think they chose certain areas to place their metalwork in relation to how they were connected with landscapes. We see this partly through the repeated visitation of hill forts and wetland areas, and speaking particularly about wetlands. We know these are very dynamic places. They've got very fragile ecosystems that are incredibly life-giving if you know how to exploit them. But when these areas flood, or when there's climatic changes or growth in peat that encroaches on certain territories, these have quite significant impact on how people live, and so these areas become arenas of life and death. So it's no wonder that these are also the areas that we see permeated with trackways and platforms and ways of getting across the wetlands, but often associated with a variety of material culture that's ended up in these areas. And some of it, yes, maybe casual losses, but I think some of these places where we're seeing metalwork and other finds popping up time and time again, it's probably reflective of perhaps an offering to these areas that people knew were important. So to conclude, I wholeheartedly agree with the initial statement I put forward from Andrew Fitzpatrick. It's very much about understanding this material is very much about recognizing the relationships between metal objects, the contexts and the wider patterns, as well as elements of the landscape. And hopefully what I've shown over the last 40 minutes or so has given a small glimpse into how we might start to explore that, particularly through looking at how small interactions with individual finds or isolated case studies start to fit in with these bigger picture ideas that reveal to us some of the thought processes and the selection processes that people are undertaking in the late Bronze Age. And by comparing this with the earliest Iron Age, the immediate centuries succeeding the late Bronze Age, we can see how some of this changes over time. And this in turn reflects social changes over time. If you're interested to hear more, read more, this is a shameless plug for the article on which this paper is based, that's coming out in the next proceedings, Somerset, an Archaeological Natural History Society. And I just want to close by saying thank you to everyone for listening and acknowledging the contributions, those listed here, to images and useful discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was really good. That's raised a load of questions, hasn't it? In fact, we've got quite a lot of questions coming in already. So yeah, plenty to talk about, I think. So my personal question is, somewhere in the back of my mind, I remember somebody saying to me that these socketed axes might have been used as currency. What do you think?
Yeah, it's socketed axes occur in such large numbers that debates surrounding them range from they were all tools, or some of them must have they were some form of proto-currency. They were often so standardized that if you were given an axe, you knew roughly what sort of amount of metal you were being given. Some of the later axes are produced in really odd compositions of metal, which means that they wouldn't have been usable. And then that's led to the suggestion that their only function is as a lump of metal. And I'm talking, they have really high tin contents or really high lead contents that would have made them unusable as an axe.
That'd be really soft, wouldn't they?
They would have been really soft, really brittle. And
yeah.
I think some of it, I'm less sold on the ingot idea, I must admit. I think that what you do when you add really a lot of lead and a lot of tin to these objects is you actually turn them silvery. And I think color is part of what's being sought after here. And some of these axes they show really extensive signs of use as well. So we have lots of different things. We have lots of different things going on with axes, and some of them may very well have served as some sort of currency or ingot, but certainly not all axes. And I see more axes that have been used than not used. So
as axes
or as craft tools or something. So I'm less sold on the ingot idea, but it was it has been a popular idea and occasionally resurges with new evidence, and I'm always happy to be convinced otherwise.
Given that they must have made quite a lot of effort to get the metal in the first place, they must have had some value in some way. I
believe so. And I mean, the beautiful thing about metal is it can be recycled. So if you have an axe and you use it and you wear it out, then it melt it down and reuse it, and you do
start all over again.
It has two levels of value to you, I guess.
Yeah, we've got a question here. How did people get from Wales to Somerset to make deposits by sea or overland via Gloucester?
We know that people are making some quite extreme journeys at this time, in vessels that you really wouldn't want to go out in if you had the choice. So log boats, plank, sewn plank boats. We know that these are vessels that are being used to cross the Channel. They're being used to cross the North Sea. They're being used across the Irish Sea. I think if you have the option of going across water, that's the shortest distance to get across the Bristol Channel. And the Bristol Channel, by comparison with something like the English Channel, is slightly less daunting, provided you knew what you were doing, I guess.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't want to do it.
No,
but it's a good question, because I kind of automatically assume they are going across water.
Yes. Well, it surely would be more straightforward than trying to get through land that didn't have motorways.
Yeah. Although getting from Cardiff to North Somerset is difficult now, even with motorways. So
yeah, this is true. Question here: does the distribution of finds across the southwest have any relationship to the geology or the available raw materials? Well, it must do, surely.
Yeah, a little bit, certainly. I mean, I pointed out the concentration of finds made on the Cornish tip. That happens to be on top of the biggest tin lode in Western Europe. It seems highly unlikely that people are visiting this area, bearing a lot of metalwork and not taking resources.
Absolutely. Is it useful to tell people watching what bronze is made out of?
Yeah, yes, yeah, that's a very good point. Bronze at this time is made primarily of tin and copper, and it's about 10% tin, and the rest is made of copper. But during the late Bronze Age, they start adding small amounts of lead, about 2 or 3% lead. So there's no zinc. It's not a brass. It's very much a pure form of bronze. So in terms of where you're finding this material, you've obviously got areas like the Mendips, that's good sources of lead. There's smatterings of lead across Britain. It's relatively common. And the same with copper sources, much more readily available. Certainly in the Southwest Peninsula, though we haven't yet got evidence that people are using copper from the Southwest.
All right, you mean like down Devon and Cornwall?
Yeah, down Devon and Cornwall, that direction. Copper, where it's analysed, seems to be deriving from the Swiss Alps, of all places, and from mines in Germany. But earlier on in the Bronze Age, sources in Wales and Ireland are being exploited. And then when you get to where is tin coming from, this is a really interesting question, because tin sources are really rare, and they're quite hard to exploit. So Cornwall and Devon have really big loads of tin. Same in Brittany has some tin, but to a lesser extent. Iberian Peninsula and central Germany. But it's really hard to source where this material is coming from. So we're assuming that some Cornish tin is being used, but we haven't yet got the silver bullet that conclusively says this. In relation to the original question, yeah, we see more deposits occurring, particularly around areas where sources are common. But for instance, South Devon is an area that we know boats were coming into across the Channel, and this is where we find all of the deposits. So there does seem to be a correlation between where people are travelling to and where they're burying the metal, and partly that's linked to the resources, I think.
It's always sort of staggering to think about the distances that people were travelling in those times.
Yeah.
They must have been doing it mostly by walking.
Yeah.
Okay, so a question here: did the people who lived in North Devon and East Cornwall have an alternative to depositing metalwork rather than following the custom elsewhere?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I've yet to see any evidence that they are doing anything substantially different in terms of depositional practices. It's a very curious sort of distribution hole for the region, that we just have very little evidence of deposition happening. I certainly I'm not aware of big caches of pottery or stone tools being buried there. Again, settlement evidence is pretty sparse. And as far as I understand it, it's not for want of looking. If you look on the portable antiquities scheme for, let's say, Roman finds, again, you've got a fairly substantial gap in that sort of area. So it seems to be a genuine, I don't know, hole, I guess. But we know there were antiquarians operating in that area. And we know that metal detectorists are prolific. They're not going to just ignore North Devon.
No,
Yeah.
definitely not. They get everywhere.
So I really don't know what's going on there. I wish I could explain it, but
no, but it's good to ask the questions.
Yes, it is. Yeah,
absolutely.
No, it's made me think actually. So.
Yeah, good. I've got another question here. Is there any link between the sources of the metal and the regional styles of the axes? Are they getting different styles down in Devon? On the Mendip?
No, not that I've ever drawn a link between. I've never seen evidence that suggests that. What seems to be more common is as different sources get used over time, that seems to be linked with changes in axes. So when in earlier centuries in the Middle Bronze Age, when Welsh copper is being used, there's quite a lot of kind of Welsh style axes that coming out and being dispersed, and they're clearly being dispersed along the metal networks. We're not getting Swiss axes cropping up in Somerset, for instance, even though we know that some of this material must have been, that some of the raw material is being transported up from these areas.
But do we get Somerset axes in Switzerland?
No. I would argue that southwest Britain in general, from Cornwall to Somerset, lacks a regionally distinct axe. If that makes sense. The Yorkshire style axes, to Bronze Age metal nerds like myself, that you can recognise it a mile off. But to the average person, I actually don't know whether they'd have gone, that's a Yorkshire axe. Which is why I think it's much more about the ideology of how you build a hoard rather than this is an axe from Yorkshire and this is what's important.
Okay. So it's all about hoard building, really. Whatever that meant.
Yeah, that's often been my impression. I mean, these people have often tried to find patterns in how hoarding has been done and why, but it ignores the fact that people are not rational and nobody does the same thing the same way twice. If you know that you have to bury stuff in the ground, you know let's say that's your belief system. Your belief system is you have to offer things up to a god.
Yeah.
You're going to offer up things that are important to you, not things that are important to your neighbor. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, it does. Yes.
So
it's an interesting idea, isn't it? Sort of.
Yeah. So
because you often get people saying, well, they're obviously worried that somebody was going to come and steal it all, but that's really not what was going on.
Well, it doesn't seem that way.
No.
But I seem to, the more I look into this practice, the more it's humans doing weird things, as we've always done. I like to draw the comparison with time capsules. Everyone knows, as a community, you know that if you're going to put a time capsule in the ground, you put in the objects that are significant to you and your community. And everyone is burying time capsules in the same way, but everyone's putting something different into them.
Yes. Lovely idea.
And that's what I think is happening in the Bronze Age.
I like that. I think that's a good point to finish on, actually. No, I really enjoyed that. I knew I was going to, and then actually, what you said actually bore out. And I hope that everybody will realise that this is going to be on the SANHS website. So if you need to watch it again, please do go and have a look at the SANHS website in a few days' time. It should be there. Thank you very much, Matt. And thank you for putting in the effort to do that.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got some more events coming up at SANHS. Tomorrow night, if you go down to the Southwest Heritage Trust, John Page will be talking about the Reverend Thomas Gould, Vicar of Axbridge. So that's tomorrow night, the 25th at the Southwest Heritage Trust. So it's a live event. Perhaps more exciting for me anyway, will be on the 4th of November in Watchet. The SANHS is having its Associated Societies Day. So that's a whole day event when we will have a series of lectures in the morning by the local associated societies. So we've got the mineral line will be giving a talk. Trying to remember now. We've got about four or five lectures in the morning, and then some of the museums will be open in the afternoon. So that's going to be a really good day in Watchet on the 4th of November. And later on in November, on the 30th, we've got another webinar coming up about the Tone Works in Wellington, which is a really fascinating site. And we're going to hear a bit more about that on the 30th of November. And for those members of SANHS, 2nd of December, we hope we'll have the Wyndham Hall open again, which has just been restored, and we're hoping to have a special time for the members of SANHS. So if you want to look at further details of events and webinars, do go and have a look on the SANHS website. Everything's there for you. Okay, if you want to donate towards the webinar, don't forget, there'll be a donate button. It's now appeared in the chat. Well done. And that only leaves me to thank Matthew for his excellent talk, and of course the webinar team, Nathanael, Tony and Allan, and of course thank you for coming along, and we hope we'll see you all again at another SANHS event or lecture. So thank you and good night.